The loneliest man in the valley took the two loneliest women in the territory. The first thing I noticed was the mule. Not the wagon, not the woman on the seat. The mule left rear hock swollen up the size of a man's fist, the animal standing crooked, favoring it, and she was still asking it to move. I could see from 200 yards that the hock was bad. Shouldn't have been asked to carry weight that morning, let alone haul a loaded wagon in heat that made the air shimmer like wet glass above the flats. I pulled Cutter up. He felt it before I did, dropped his head, blew hard through his nose. I sat there a minute. It was none of my business. There was a time I would have ridden past. Plenty of people in this valley had ridden past me, and I'd noticed that too, in my own way, and stored it where a man stores things he doesn't want to look at directly. But the mule was going to go down. You could see it. And whoever was on that wagon was going to be sitting in the flats in July heat with a mule that couldn't stand, and whatever was in that wagon wasn't going anywhere. I rode over. She didn't hear me coming until I was 30 feet off, and when she turned her head, the look on her face wasn't fear so much as calculation, like she was already working out what my arrival would cost her. Older than I expected, maybe 45, maybe 50, hard to say. The sun and some particular kind of sorrow had done something to the lines around her eyes that made the number difficult. She was wearing a dress that had been good once. Brown hair going gray at the temples, pulled back tight the way women do when they're trying to hold something together. She had a rifle on the seat beside her, but she hadn't reached for it. I stopped Cutter at what I judged to be a non-threatening distance and took my hat off, partly out of habit and partly so she could see my face plain in the sun. "Your mule's got a bad hock," I said. She looked at me steadily. "I know. He goes much further, he won't go at all." "I know that too." I waited, she waited. A red-tailed hawk turned a lazy circle overhead, and neither of us watched it. "You got a destination?" I asked. "Millerton." Millerton was 31 miles. I knew because I'd ridden it enough times to stop counting and start knowing. "You're not going to make Millerton today," I said. "Not with that animal." "I understand that." She wasn't disagreeable about it. She was just stating what she understood, and what I was telling her wasn't new information. It was confirmation of what she already knew and had been hoping wasn't true. I put my hat back on. "My place is 3 miles northeast. I can have a look at the hawk, give you water, let you rest the animal. That's all I'm offering. Then you can decide." She looked at me for a long moment. Whatever she was measuring, she was precise about it. Then she looked away down the flats in the direction of Millerton, all that flat, empty distance, and she nodded once. "All right," she said. I didn't know then about the girl. "My name is Earl Colton. I run cattle, or I did, before the drought, and then the price crash of '86 took most of what I'd built. What's left is 400 acres of decent grass when it rains, and not much when it doesn't. A small herd that I've kept at a number I can manage alone. A house that's plumb and tight even if it's not large, and a well that has never once run dry in 22 years, which is the single piece of luck I can point to without qualification. I came to the valley in 1871. I was 23. I'd come from Ohio with my cousin Lester, who'd read something in a pamphlet about homesteading land and had gotten the idea into his head, the way young men get ideas, hot and total, without accounting for the gap between what a pamphlet says and what the land actually is. Lester lasted 14 months. The isolation got him, then a bad winter, then a fence dispute with a neighbor that turned uglier than it needed to and cost him more than he had. He went back to Ohio and married his schoolteacher, and I heard he opened a hardware store eventually. I didn't leave. I'm not sure I could tell you why exactly, except that I'd looked at this valley for the first time on a morning in October of 1871, when the light came in sideways from the east and made everything gold and long-shadowed, and something in me recognized it the way you recognize a word in a language you didn't know you spoke. "This is the place," some part of me said, and I believed it, and I've never fully stopped believing it even through the drought and the price crash, and the particular loneliness of certain winters. There was a woman, briefly, a few years after I came, not a story worth telling because it wasn't her fault and it wasn't mine. It was just that this land asks more than some people can give, and I didn't know how to ask for what I needed, and she went back east and married a man who worked in a bank, and I hope to God she's happy. After that it was just the work. I'm not saying I was unhappy. I'm not sure unhappy is the right word. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a man who's been alone long enough. It's not peace exactly. It's more like the absence of friction, the way a room feels when nobody's argued in it for a long time. I knew that quiet well. I lived inside it the way a man lives inside a coat he's worn so long he can't feel it anymore. The valley knew me as a man who kept to himself. That's not a complaint. I preferred it to what the alternative looked like. The men who couldn't keep to themselves and made everyone around them miserable because of it. I'd seen enough of that. But there were mornings when I'd come in from the early check and pour coffee and stand at the window looking at nothing, and the quiet was so complete it had a sound to it, like a held note, and I'd become aware of it in a way that wasn't comfortable. I was 51 years old when I found that mule on the flats. Her name was Margaret Prout. She told me that on the ride back to my place, keeping pace with the mule which I was leading, slowly, watching the leg, and she offered the name like a fact she was used to having to produce, and not like it was something she particularly felt about. I didn't ask what had happened. People on the flats in July with a bad-hocked mule and a loaded wagon didn't need to be asked. They'd tell you what they wanted you to know when they were ready. She told me anyway. Maybe she needed to say it aloud before we got there. Maybe she'd been holding it a long time. Her husband had died in March, pneumonia. They'd had a small spread 40 miles east, not mine, different direction. And the husband's brother had shown up 3 weeks after the funeral with a paper from a lawyer in Santa Fe that said the land went to him under the terms of a note her husband had signed 4 years before when the brother had lent them money to get through a bad year. Whether the paper was legal or not she couldn't say. She had no money to find out, and the brother had men with him and she didn't. So she'd packed what she could in the wagon and she'd gone. She was going to Millerton because she had a cousin there, a woman she hadn't seen in 11 years, but the cousin had written twice since the funeral and both letters were kind. I listened to all of this. I didn't say anything for a while. Then I said, "What's the cousin's name?" She looked over at me. "Nora Petch," she said. "Her husband runs the feed store." I knew Hap Petch, not well, but I'd bought from him. Solid man, not the kind to leave family out on the flats. "Hap Petch's wife is your cousin," I said. "Yes." "Then you'll be all right," I said, "when you get there." She was quiet a moment. "Yes," she said, "when I get there." We were a mile from my place when I heard it, a sound from the wagon bed, low and specific, not cargo shifting. I looked back and the canvas over the wagon's load moved, just slightly, and then was still. "Mrs. Prout," I said. "Her name is Clara," she said before I could ask anything. "She's 16, she's shy. She doesn't cause trouble." I turned back and looked ahead at the trail. "All right," I said. That was all I said. The girl came out from under the canvas when we pulled into the yard. She did it quietly, without drama, the way a person moves when they're used to making themselves small in spaces that might not welcome them. She was slight, thin in the particular way of someone who hasn't been eating enough for a while, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that were very still and watchful. Not frightened exactly, more like a bird on a fence post that could go either direction. I had learned over 51 years that you don't make direct attention at a skittish thing. You do what you're doing and let it figure you out at its own pace. So I led the mule to the water trough and let him drink, and then I got him into the shade of the barn and had a look at the hock. It was worse up close, not broken, but swollen and hot, and there was the beginning of an abscess that if you left it would take the leg. I dealt with worse. I knew what it needed. I got the poultice supplies from the barn shelf, salt, comfrey root I kept dried, clean cloth, and I worked on the hock while Margaret Prout stood in the barn door and watched. and after a while I heard the girl come in behind her and stop there. "Is he going to be all right?" the girl asked. Her voice was quieter than I expected. "He's going to be fine," I said. "He needed somebody to stop him." I felt her watching me work. I didn't look up. "Nobody stopped him before," she said. "No," I said. "I could see that." I finished with the poultice, wrapped it properly, gave the mule a measure of good hay and a pat on the neck. Then I washed my hands at the pump and went to see about getting them some food. The house has 3 rooms. The main room, which is the kitchen and sitting room both, a bedroom, and a smaller room off the back that I'd used as a storeroom for years. I'd kept it clean out of habit, not out of expectation. There was a cot in there under a canvas, 2 hooks on the wall, a window that faced west so it caught the evening light. I cleared the storeroom out, stacked things in the barn, and I made up the cot and brought in the spare blankets. Then I thought about it and went and got the rocker from the main room and put it by the window. Margaret Prout watched me move the rocker in without commenting on it. The girl was sitting at the kitchen table. I put water on and found the last of the salt pork and some dried beans, and I started cooking. The girl watched me cook. She had the concentrated attention of a cat watching something it's uncertain about, not threatening, just intent. "You live alone," she said, not a question. "Yes," I said. "How long?" "Long time," I said. She thought about that. "Don't you get lonely?" I didn't answer right away. I was cutting the salt pork into the pot and thinking about how to answer honestly, without making the answer into something it didn't need to be. "Some," I said. "You get used to it." "That sounds sad," she said. "Clara," Mrs. Prout said from the doorway. "It's all right," I said. "It probably is sad, hadn't thought about it in a while." The girl seemed satisfied with that, or at least she left it where it was. She pulled her knees up onto the chair the way young people do when they're getting comfortable somewhere, and I stirred the beans and thought about the last time I'd had someone in this house. 3 years, maybe. Hap Petch's man, a rider named Dobie, who'd come to pick up a bull I'd sold off. He'd stayed for supper, and we'd talked about cattle prices and the weather, and he'd left before dark. Before that, the circuit preacher who came through in autumn and seemed genuinely glad of the coffee and genuinely uninterested in the silence. 3 years. I set the table for 3. There's a thing that happens when a house has people in it. Not noise, though there was that too. A fork against a plate, Mrs. Prout asking if there was water, the girl laughing once at something quietly, and then catching herself like laughter was something she'd gotten out of the habit of. But underneath the noise, the house itself seems to shift. The walls, the floor, like a building that's been cold remembering what heat feels like. I noticed it in small ways. I noticed the lamp needed trimming, and I trimmed it properly for the first time in months. I noticed the wood box was low, and I brought in a full load before bed. In the morning, I built the fire before the sun was up, the way I used to when there was a point to having the kitchen warm early, and then I stood there a minute wondering why I'd done it before I remembered. They slept late, which made sense. They'd been on the road a long time and carrying a weight I couldn't see. I didn't wake them. I did the morning check of the cattle, came back, and by the time I was washing up at the pump, I could hear movement in the house. Mrs. Prout came out first. She'd redone her hair and her eyes were clearer, whatever sleep does when you finally get some that's real. She stood on the porch and looked at the land, and I stood at the pump and let her look. "This is good land," she said. "It is," I said. "Doesn't show much from the road." "Most good things don't," I said. She looked at me sideways, and something shifted at the corner of her mouth that might have been the beginning of a smile. "The grass is better than I expected. I run fewer cattle than I could. Lets the grass come back." "Smart," she said. "Common sense," I said, "but it's the same thing mostly." Clara came out a few minutes later with her hair loose and her feet bare on the porch boards, and she looked like a different person than the girl who'd been watching me from under the wagon canvas. Younger, somehow. More herself. She looked out at the pasture where the horses were and she said, "Can I go see the horses?" I said yes. I watched her cross the yard, careful, quick, sure on her feet, and I looked at Mrs. Prout, and Mrs. Prout was watching the girl, and on her face was something I recognized because I'd seen it on my mother's face once, a long time ago. It's the look of someone watching over a thing they've decided to keep safe no matter what it costs them. "She's not your daughter," I said. It wasn't a question. "No," she said. "She was living with us before." She paused. "Her own people weren't, they weren't people she could go back to. My husband and I took her in 2 years ago. She's a good girl." "I can see that," I said. "She hasn't got anyone else," Mrs. Prout said, and the way she said it made clear that this was information she was giving me, not asking me to do anything about. She was telling me the shape of what was. "Then you've got someone," I said. She looked at me then, really looked, and I met it without looking away. "Yes," she said, "I suppose we've got each other." I told them they could stay until the mule was right. That was 3 days minimum, likely 4. They should rest and eat, and I would deal with the mule, and they could help if they wanted or not if they didn't. On the first afternoon, Mrs. Prout sat at the kitchen table with a piece of harness leather and a needle, and she mended 3 things I hadn't even known needed mending. She did it without asking. She just picked them up and did it. I noticed this and said nothing. Clara brushed out my horses. All 3 of them, including the old sorrel mare who'd bitten the last man who tried to touch her. The mare put her nose into the girl's chest and stood quiet. I watched this from the barn door, and I thought about the patience in that, the particular thing a young person has to have, or has to develop, to earn the trust of an animal that's decided not to give it. Evening of the first day, I sat on the porch and Mrs. Prout brought out 2 cups of coffee and sat in the other chair, and we sat there in the blue light as the valley went dark. Clara had gone to bed early. The coyotes started up across the east ridge the way they do in summer. "You've been here 22 years, she said. "You said that." "Came in 71. "Were you trying to build something specific? Or just trying to get somewhere?" I thought about it, trying to be honest with myself about something I hadn't examined lately. "Both," I said. "Started as trying to get somewhere that wasn't where I was. Then I got here and the land got under me and I stopped trying to be anywhere else." She turned her cup in her hands. "My husband felt that way about our place, 40 miles east. He talked about the land the same way, like it was listening." "It is," I said, "in a way." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know if I'll find that again," she said. "At my age, starting over." "You're not starting over," I said. "Starting over is for people who don't have anything to carry. You've got a lot to carry." She looked at me. "That's not a bad thing," I said. "The carrying gives you something to hold on to." She didn't say anything to that, but she didn't look away either, and we sat there until the dark was full and complete, and the first stars came in over the ridge. The second evening she was the one already on the porch when I came in from the evening check. Just sitting there, the coffee going cold in her hand, watching the ridge go purple with the sun behind it. She didn't say anything when I sat down. I didn't say anything either. We sat in the dark together and listened to the valley settle, which it does in the evening, a different kind of quiet than the daytime, less empty and more inhabited, like the land itself is breathing slower. At some point she said, "I forget what it's like not to be afraid." I looked at her. "The last 4 months," she said. "There was always something to be afraid of. The brother, the road, the money running out. Clara." She paused. "I hadn't realized how much of me was just holding myself together until I stopped having to." "You can set it down here," I said, "for a few days." She looked at me then, and her face in the dark had something unguarded in it that I thought she probably wouldn't show in the daylight, at least not yet. "Yes," she said, "I think I can." On the second day I showed Clara how to check a poultice. She had steady hands, which surprised me. Most people flinch a little around a swollen leg, worried about the animal's reaction, and she didn't flinch. She pressed the cloth carefully, the way I showed her, and checked the heat and looked at the color of the skin under the cloth and then looked up at me for confirmation. "It's going down," I told her. She nodded. She looked at the mule's eye, which is something I do too. You can read a lot in the eye of an animal in pain, whether the pain is holding steady or shifting. "He trusts you," she said. "He trusts the process," I said. "There's a difference. He knows what I'm doing is helping even if he doesn't know why." Is that better or worse, trusting something without knowing why? I thought about her. Not quite 16, and she asked questions like a person twice, that age who'd spent time figuring out the difference between what words said and what they meant. "Depends on what you're trusting," I said. She seemed to accept that. We walked back to the house together, and she told me she'd learned to read from the Bible and a book of natural history that someone had left at the place she'd lived before Margaret's. And she told me she'd read both of them so many times she'd memorized parts without meaning to. The way you memorize a road you've traveled too often. She said she thought she'd like to read more books if she ever had the chance. I went to the bedroom and got the 2 books off the shelf, a history of the Mexican War and a novel by a man named Hardy that someone had given me years ago and that I'd read twice, the second time more carefully, and I put them on the kitchen table. I didn't make anything of it. I just put them there. She picked up the Hardy that evening and read until the lamp needed oil. Second afternoon, something happened. I was coming in from the back pasture when I saw the rider. He came from the direction of the main road, not the track, off the road, cutting across the scrub toward my place, like he knew where he was going even though nobody who knew where they were going came that way. I put Cutter behind the barn and I watched. He was a young man, maybe 30, on a gray horse that was too good for him, by which I mean the horse was quality and he was not. He came to the yard and pulled up and looked around. Mrs. Prout came out onto the porch. I could hear from where I was just. "Saw your wagon on the road," he said, not a greeting. "Wondered where you went to." "Stopped to rest the mule," she said. "Brother wants to know if you took anything that wasn't yours." The way he said it told you everything about what kind of errand he was on, and who had sent him, and what sort of man that was. There was a particular ease in his voice that people get when they're used to being the one who can say things like that to women alone. Mrs. Prout held herself very still. "I took what belongs to me," she said. I came around the corner of the barn then, not fast, not slow. I had the rifle because I'd been doing a check and I'd had it along and I kept it easy, not raised, just present. The rider's horse shied at my appearance. The rider had to work to settle it, which put him at an angle that was less comfortable than he'd been. "This your place?" he said to me. "It is," I said. "These women your people?" I looked at him for a long moment. "They're my guests," I said, "which makes their business my business. You want to say something to Mrs. Prout, you can do that and then you can go." He looked at me. I was 51, which is older than 30 by a lot, and I was also 6 feet tall and had been doing hard work in hard country for 22 years, and the rifle was in my hand even if it was pointed at the ground. He did the math. "Brother just wants to know his property is accounted for," he said. "His property," I said, "is wherever he left it. Mrs. Prout traveled with what's hers. Now you can ride back and tell him that, or you can get off that horse, and we can talk about it in a more detailed way, but either way you're done here." He looked at Mrs. Prout, then at me. Then he pulled the gray around and he rode back the way he'd come. Not fast, men like that don't leave fast. They leave at a pace that's supposed to say something, but he left. I stood in the yard until he was past the tree line. Then I went to the pump and worked the handle and put my face in the cold water and held it there a minute. When I straightened up, Mrs. Prout was standing a few feet off. "I brought trouble to your door," she said. "No," I said, "he brought trouble, he's gone." "He might come back with others." "He might," I said. "Then I'll deal with it then." She stood there looking at me, and she seemed to be sorting through things she wanted to say, trying to find the right one. "Why," she said finally, I wiped my face with my sleeve. Why what? You owe us nothing, you don't know us. I thought about this. Standing in my yard in the afternoon heat, water still cold on my face. The hawk was back, or a different hawk, I couldn't be sure, circling above the east ridge. I know enough, I said. She looked at me for a moment longer. Then she went back inside. After a minute I heard the sound of water and plates, and she was making supper. That evening at the table Clara was quiet in a different way than she'd been quiet before, not watchful, but settled, something in her that had been held going slack. She ate more than she'd eaten the first night. Afterward she asked if she could take the lamp to the storeroom to read, and I said yes, and I trimmed the wick first so it would last. Margaret and I sat at the table after, and she poured what was left of the coffee, and we didn't talk about the writer. We talked about other things, or mostly she talked and I listened, which I found I didn't mind. She taught school for 2 years before she married in a county in Kansas, and she had opinions about it and told them to me plainly. She had an opinion about almost everything, and she stated opinions the way she stated facts, directly, without decorating them, and without expecting you to simply agree. I pushed back twice, and she pushed back at me without any particular heat, just conviction, and I found myself paying attention to the substance of what she said because it was substantial. It had been a long time since I'd had a conversation with that kind of give in it. The mule was ready on the 4th day. Not fully healed, that would take another week or more of light work, but right to travel at a gentle pace if she didn't push him. I knew they needed to go. I didn't say it and they didn't say it, but it was there. The way the end of things is always there just before it comes, felt before it's said. Morning of the 4th day, I went out early and I checked the mule, and then I went to the barn, and I found the extra set of harness I had, better than what she'd been using, and I switched it out for the one on her wagon without telling her I was doing it. Better fitted, less likely to cause trouble on the road. The kind of thing that matters over 31 miles. I checked the wagon wheels. One of the rear wheels had a loose iron tire. You could hear it if the wagon was moving on rough ground, a slight tick on every rotation. I heated the tire and reseated it and cooled it proper. An hour's work. Not a big thing. But over 31 miles, a small thing you let go can become a big thing before you get where you're going. I went through my spare food stores. Not extravagant, I wasn't trying to empty my cellar, but what 2 people needed for a 2-day trip. Salt pork, hardtack, dried apricots I'd put up the year before, a paper of coffee. I boxed it up and put it in the wagon bed. I did all of this before they woke up. When Mrs. Prout came out, she stood in the yard and looked at the wagon, and then she looked at me, and she didn't say anything for a moment. The harness, she said. Yours was cracked, I said. This one's better. She walked around the wagon slowly, saw the tire, looked in the wagon bed and saw the box. She turned and looked at me. Earl, she said. It was the first time she'd used my name. I'd used hers twice. She'd been careful not to use mine. It's not a big road, I said. But it's better to have it. She stood in the yard looking at me. The morning light was still low and east, and it caught the gray in her hair and the line of her jaw and the straightness she had, not stiffness, not armor, genuine structure, the kind that comes from a person who's been through the things she'd been through and is still standing. I don't know how to repay this, she said. You don't repay hospitality, I said. That's what makes it hospitality. She looked at me for a long time. The kind of look that goes past the surface of a person, down to the grain of them, the way you look at wood when you're deciding if it's sound. You're a good man, she said. The words were plain, and she said them plain, without decoration, without the soft coloring people sometimes use to make words go down easier. Just the words, and the weight she meant them with. I can't tell you exactly what happened in me when she said it. I can tell you I didn't look away. Thank you, I said. First time in a long time those words came out of me and meant anything specific. Clara came out then. She'd done her hair the way she did it when she was trying to look older than she was, and she was carrying the Hardy novel, and she held it out to me. "Thank you for the loan of it," she said. "Keep it," I said. She looked at the book in her hands and then up at me. "Are you sure?" "I've read it twice," I said. "It should go to someone who will get something new from it." She stood there holding it, and then she stepped forward and she hugged me. Just, without warning, the way young people do. Her arms around me and her face against my chest, and she held on for a moment. I put my hand on her back briefly, the way you do when someone holds you and you're trying to hold back at the same time. Then she stepped back and she was blinking hard and not looking at me. I cleared my throat and went to the mule and checked the traces one more time, even though they were fine. I stood in the yard and I watched them out to the tree line. Mrs. Prude on the seat, Clara beside her, the mule moving well, good gait, rested, the hock holding. The wagon didn't tick. The harness lay right. I watched until the cottonwoods took them, and then a little longer, watching the gap where they'd been. The yard was quiet. I went in and poured a cup of coffee, and I stood at the window looking at the yard. The rocker was gone from the main room, still in the storeroom, and I thought about going and getting it, and I didn't move. 3 days. It had only been 3 days. I stood there a long time. Then I went back out. There was always work, and the work was a reliable thing. It didn't require anything from you except your hands and your attention, and those I could give. I worked until the light was gone, and then I came in and I made supper and I ate it alone, which was what I always did, and the house was quiet in the old way. But quieter than before somehow. As if the house had learned what it was missing. The letter came 11 days later, carried by Hap Petch's rider who happened to be going my direction. He left it on the fence post at the gate the way people do when they know you might not be home and need the thing to wait for you. I saw it from the pasture, came in, unsaddled Cutter, washed up, and then went and got it. The handwriting was careful, practiced, like someone who'd learned to write properly and was still conscientious about it. It said they'd arrived safe, that Nora and Hap had been generous, that there was room for them and work for Clara, and that Millerton had a school, which was something she'd started looking into. At the bottom, not a long paragraph, just a few sentences, it said this: "You gave us shelter when we had none. You gave us safety when that man came, and you did it without being asked and without explaining yourself. I have been thinking about those 4 days since we left, and I will tell you honestly that I have not felt that safe since my husband died. You are a man of uncommon decency, and I am glad to know you exist. If you are ever near Millerton, I would be glad to see you. If you aren't, I hope you know that what you did mattered. Margaret Prude." I folded the letter. I put it in my shirt pocket. I stood there in the yard with the late afternoon light going gold across the grass, and the cattle moving slow in the far pasture, and the hawk on its current above the ridge. Decency. I hadn't thought about myself in those terms in a long time, not in any terms particularly. You live alone a long time, you stop seeing yourself as anything specific. You're just the person doing the next thing, then the thing after. You forget that other people can see you. She'd seen me. I went in and made supper, and while the beans were on, I got out paper and a pen and I wrote back. I wasn't sure what to say, so I said what was true. That they'd been welcome, that the mule was something anyone would have done, that the house felt different for those 4 days, and I hadn't fully worked out whether that was good or just unfamiliar. I wrote, "I am not often near Millerton, but I can be." Then I looked at that a long time and let it stand. It was 6 weeks before I went. I had reasons: the herd, the fence line that needed work, the well casing that had a slow leak I'd been watching. Good reasons, real reasons. But underneath them was the other thing, which was that I had spent 20-some years building a life around not needing anything from anyone, and the machinery of that life doesn't just stand aside because you've decided to want something. It holds. You have to push. I pushed. Her second letter had come before I left. Shorter than the first, warmer in a different way, less formal, like she'd stopped drafting and started talking. She said Clara had started at the school and was a natural at it. She said the cousin, Nora, made the best biscuits she'd encountered in 20 years, but she wasn't going to tell Nora that because the woman was already dangerously confident. She said she'd found work helping the doctor's wife with accounts, which she'd never done before but found she had a head for. And then at the end, I find myself curious what the valley looks like in September. You described it once, the light. I read that 3 times, and then I saddled Cutter and rode to Millerton. I rode into Millerton on a Tuesday in early September when the heat had broken and the air smelled of coming autumn and something else, the particular smell of a town after rain, wet dust and horses and wood smoke. I knew where Hap Petch's feed store was. I went there first. Hap was a broad man, built like a barn door, with a handshake like getting your hand caught in something. He looked at me when I walked in and grinned like he'd been expecting me. "Colton," he said. "Petch," I said. "Margaret said you might come by one of these days." He said it casually, the way you say something casual when it's actually specific information you've been waiting to give someone. "She around?" I said. "She's at the house," he said. "Clara too, most afternoons. She started at the school helping the teacher, good with the kids." He said this with genuine satisfaction, the way a man talks about something good that happened on his watch. "She's a fine girl, that one." "She is," I said. He gave me directions to the house, which I didn't need. Millerton was small enough. But I let him give them because it was clearly something he wanted to do. The house was at the west end of the main street, a frame house with a good porch and a garden that had been recently worked. I tied Cutter at the post and I stood there for a moment, and then I went up and knocked. Clara opened the door. She looked at me and then she looked past me at Cutter tied to the post, and she said, "I knew you'd come." The way young people say things they can't possibly know but do know anyway, by some sense that's mostly confidence and partly something else. "Is Mrs. Prout here?" I said. "She's in the back," Clara said. She stepped aside to let me in, and as I passed she said quietly, "She'll be glad." Margaret Prout came out of the kitchen wiping her hands on a cloth, and she stopped when she saw me standing in Nora Petch's parlor with my hat in my hands. For a moment neither of us said anything. She looked the same. The gray in her hair, the careful posture, the particular set of her that was not stiffness but structure, and also different, rested perhaps, or less braced. Like a woman who'd put down a weight she'd carried so long she'd stopped noticing the shape of it. "You came," she said. "Said I might," I said. "You did." Clara appeared in the doorway to the kitchen, looked at us both, and then disappeared again in a way that made clear she was removing herself on purpose. "I got your letter," I said. "I got yours," she said. "I'm not often near Millerton," I said, "but I can be." She smiled then, a real one, not the small possible smile from the morning on my porch but a full one, and it changed her face the way weather changes a valley. "That's a long ride for occasional visits," she said. "Depends on what you're coming to," I said. She looked at me steadily, that measuring look again, precise and unhurried. "Earl," she said. "Margaret," I said. We stood in the light from the west window, the afternoon coming through and laying itself across the floor between us. It was a long moment, the kind that is both slow and fast, the kind that a man can hold in his memory exactly as it was for a very long time. Then she stepped forward and she put her hand on my arm, her fingers around my forearm, through the cloth of my shirt, a grip that was not tentative at all. She held on like something she'd decided. I put my other hand over hers. That was all, that was enough. I came back 3 more times before the winter closed the road. Each time I stayed 2 days. We talked the way we'd talked on the porch, back and forth with that give in it, and I began to understand her, the particular rhythm of how her mind worked, the things she cared about and why, the difference between when she was being careful and when she wasn't. She began to understand me in return, or maybe she already had and was just confirming it, because she asked questions that were specific and correct, The kind of questions you only ask if you've been paying attention. Clara was present and not present, which was a skill she had developed to a high degree. She would be in a room and also somehow not in it, reading her books, tending whatever needed tending. And then when she had something to add to what Margaret and I were talking about, she'd add it without warning precisely, and then go back to being elsewhere. On my third visit, she told me she'd started teaching the Tuesday reading class herself. The school teacher, a young man from back east who was earnest and not poorly educated, had too many pupils and too many grade levels, and Clara had offered to take the youngest ones for reading 2 mornings a week. They like her, Margaret told me. She has patience she doesn't seem to know she has. She knows, I said. You think so? She knows, I said. She chooses to spend it. That's different from not knowing you have it. Margaret looked at me, and then at Clara across the room, and I thought she was considering this, turning it over. That's right, she said. That's exactly right. The last visit before the winter road closed, I stayed 3 days. On the last morning I was saddling Cutter in the yard, and Margaret came out in her coat, and she stood there while I worked, and neither of us said anything for a while. Then she said, I want to ask you something and I want you to answer it honestly, which I know you'll do, so that's not the hard part. The hard part is asking. I kept my hands on the cinch, but I was listening. Do you want this, she said, not the visits, this, whatever this is becoming. I pulled the cinch tight, and I turned around and I looked at her. Yes, I said. She nodded. She looked at the ground a moment and then back up at me. I'm a particular woman, she said. I have my own ways. I'm not going to give them up because it's convenient. I know that, I said. I'm counting on it. She seemed slightly surprised by that. Then she smiled, that real smile, and she came forward and she took my face in both her hands and she kissed me once, brief and sure, and then she stepped back. Come back in the spring, she said. March, I said. March, she said. I rode out of Millerton and I rode the 31 miles back to the valley, and I rode them differently than I'd ridden them before, with a different reason at the other end of them. Cutter felt it. He had a better step going home than he'd had in a while. There's a thing you can build twice if you're careful and lucky and the person is right. It doesn't look like the first thing. It's not supposed to. It's made of different wood, cut to a different purpose, shaped by what you know now instead of what you thought you knew then. If you try to make it look like the first thing, you'll get it wrong every time. You have to let it be what it is. I'm not going to tell you it was simple. Nothing at 60 is simple. Margaret had things to work through, the grief, the way it doesn't go when you want it to, the way it waits around corners, the question of Hap and Nora and whether leaving was fair, even if they'd have been glad for her, the logistics of a woman who's made her life one way and is considering making it another. I had my own. 22 years of a particular quiet that had become identity. The habit of needing no one, which protects you, and also locks you in rooms you don't know you're in. Clara, when we told her, looked at both of us with those still, watchful eyes, and then she said, "Good," and went back to her book. I drove the wagon back with her things in the spring when the trail was good. Not all her things, she left some with Nora, but what she wanted to bring. I built her a proper wardrobe in the bedroom because she had more clothes than I'd had occasion to own. I put in a second chair at the table, a real chair, not a stool, and I cut a wider door between the storeroom and the main room so Clara, when she visited, had a room with a proper entrance and didn't have to go through the cold to get to it. I did all of this, and I'm not going to make more of it than it is. A man with a house and land and the ability to do the work does what needs doing. That's all. But I will say that doing it with someone in mind, knowing the chair was going to be used, knowing the wardrobe was going to hold her things, was different from the work I'd been doing for 22 years, and the difference was not small. The first winter she was there, it got cold in the way this valley gets cold, which is complete and serious and not interested in how you feel about it. 3 weeks below freezing, the water trough icing over every morning, the cattle bunched in the southeast corner of the pasture where the ridge cut the worst of the wind. I'd done it alone before, 22 times. I knew the work, knew the rhythms of it, knew exactly what each day of hard cold required. What I didn't know, because I hadn't known it before, was what it was like to come in out of that cold and have someone hand you a cup of coffee without being asked. What it was like to sit down to a meal in a warm kitchen and have something worth talking about while you ate it. What it was like to have the lamp on in the house visible from the yard when you came in late, so that from the pasture you could see the light in the window and know that somebody was in there. I'd been doing this work for 22 years and I'd done it well. I was competent. I knew my land and my cattle and my weather and my tools. But I understood, that winter, sitting at the table with Margaret across from me, the snow coming sideways past the window and the fire burning right and the coffee hot, I understood something I hadn't understood before. That doing the work and doing it well is one thing. And having it matter to someone, having someone there to come home to, someone who sees what it cost and thinks the man who paid it is worth knowing, that is something different. That is the thing that makes the work mean something outside of itself. She saw me, that's the plainest way I know to say it. She saw me the way you see a thing you've been looking at a long time, and finally understand what you're looking at. Not the young man I'd been or the man I might have been in other circumstances, but the man I actually was, what I'd built, what I'd kept, what I had in me to give and to hold. She looked at all of it clear-eyed and she chose it, chose me. There are men who are seen young, who grow up knowing what they're worth because somebody showed them. I wasn't one of those. But I found out at 51 in the middle of a July flat with a bad hocked mule that it's not too late to be seen. It's never too late if the woman doing the seeing is the right one. That was 4 years ago. Clara is at the Millerton School still. Not as a student anymore. She finished what she needed and stayed on to teach the young ones, which is the right work for her. She has that quality of patience that turns into authority without you noticing when it happened. She comes out to the ranch on the weekends when the weather's good and she has her room. She's filled 2 more of Hardy's books and has opinions about them. The valley looks the same as it always has. The grass is good. The cattle are a smaller herd than I once dreamed and the right size for what I can manage. The well has never run dry. What I can say about now is this: the mornings are different. Not noisier exactly, but not quiet in the old way either. The old quiet was the absence of friction, the held note. This is something else. It's the sounds of 2 people in a house who have made an agreement with each other about how they're going to live, and that agreement isn't spoken out loud. It's in the coffee cup she sets out before I'm up and the horses she's brushed while I was doing the morning check, and the way she comes out onto the porch when I come in from the far pasture, not to ask anything, just to be there when I get back. To be there when I get back. I don't know how to explain to you what that means if you haven't known the absence of it. I'm not sure I knew what I was missing while I was missing it. I had made the absence into a way of living and called it peace, and in some ways it was peace. But this is something better than peace. This is a man at the end of a long day, with someone who wanted him to come home. I'm not a sentimental man. I'm telling you plain what happened and what it is, and I don't need to dress it up. She saw me is all. She stood in my yard on a morning with the light coming east and she saw me clear, what I was worth, what I was good for, what I had in me to give, and she said so. Plain, without flourish. A good woman can do that. She can look at a man that the world has gotten used to passing by, and she can stop and she can look him in the eye and say the thing out loud that he'd stopped expecting anyone to say. That's not a small thing. Out here, where the winters are long and the land is indifferent, and a man can go 3 years between conversations that mean anything. Out here, it is the largest thing there is. The hawk's on the ridge this morning. I can see him from the porch. Margaret's inside. She's been up an hour already. I can smell the coffee and something else, the particular smell of whatever she's doing in the kitchen that will be better than what I do, and that I haven't asked about because asking would ruin the having of it. I'll go in a minute. First, I want to sit here with the morning a moment longer. The valley going light, the cattle in the far pasture, the good grass and the well that has never run dry. The hawk makes one more circle, and then I go in.